All right, so welcome officially to our workshop today, Teaching Source Evaluation, Identifying Evaluation Myths. I'm so happy that you're all here today. My name is Jane Hammonds. I'm an assistant professor in the University Libraries at Ohio State. I am the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian, and you can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. And I will share a follow-up email with everyone with all of my contact information, as well as all of the resources from the day. So no worry about trying to rush to write things down as we are going through. What we're going to be doing here today is we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some research findings related to source evaluation. We're really going to focus on 4 common, what I call source evaluation myths. And then we're going to identify some resources and some strategies for teaching more effective source evaluation. So to jump into our opening discussion here, source evaluation myths. So I have an opening question for you all, and I would love to hear what you think might be an example based on your experience and whatever capacity that is working with students. What might be a source evaluation myth that you have seen with students? And by myth, I mean something that students think that they can look at and say, this will tell me whether or not a source is credible or trustworthy, but that you think doesn't really provide them with any real solid guidance about credibility or not credible. So that's sort of what I had in mind when I was thinking of source evaluation myths, those things that students latch onto as helpful in the evaluation process, but really are not really that helpful at all. So we'll share our responses using a Jamboard. So I'll put the link to the Jamboard in one more time so folks can go out and access that. Try to get out there myself if I can. All right. So if you haven't used a Jamboard before, the easiest way to add a response is generally to go over here on the side and add a sticky note. And so you can go ahead and type your response in there, hit save, and that'll post your response there. So we'll give everyone a chance to share their responses. So we'll give it a few more seconds if folks have any additional responses that they would like to share. All right, so as you're looking at these responses, I think you see a definite theme with a lot of the answers talking about the URL and the domain as being something that many students latch onto as something that will tell them whether a source is credible or not. So that is definitely one that we're going to talk more about today. Some other responses here, look at the about page, whether it's polished looking, advanced degrees, verified checks on Twitter, whether or not it's peer reviewed, right, or whether it's published in a scholarly journal, whether or not it came from Google Scholar. Yeah. Info that is clearly stated, easy to understand is the best info. Upvotes on Reddit, likes on Twitter. Yeah, so like the popularity of the source as something that indicates credibility. Yeah, absolutely. Great. So thank you for sharing all of these. Some of these we will be encountering later on. Some we won't, although I do think that they are all really relevant, thinking about the kind of source evaluation myths that students might have. All right, so we'll go ahead and go back to our presentation. I have no idea why it's cutting off the bottom. There we go. Of course, it's being a little persnickety. 1 second. Apologies. Really slow. All right. I have no idea why it's taking so long to pop up. Sorry about that. All right. Hopefully we are finally back on track. All right, so wanted to take a few seconds just to really briefly share some research findings around student evaluation of sources. And these findings are from a report that some folks might be familiar with called Educating for Misunderstanding, that was created by the Stanford History group. And they have done several studies looking at students' ability to evaluate information that they find, especially online. And overall, the findings have been pretty dismal, that students really struggle with evaluating the credibility, the trustworthiness of the information that they find online. So you can see in this example, in one study that they did a very significant percentage of the students could not recognize a satirical article from a satirical news site, right? And then only a handful of students were able to identify the fact that a site that presented itself as nonpartisan was actually had been created by a lobbying organization, right? So these are just a couple of examples of the struggles that students might have with evaluating sources, and not just students, of course. Everyone can be challenged by evaluating information, especially online. There's just so much of it, and it can be so challenging. And what I found really interesting about thinking about this study is, it's not that students were not trying to evaluate the source. That was the purpose of the study. So students were trying to do it and they were applying evaluation strategies. But the challenge was that the strategies that they were using were just not working. Right. They were really focused on, parts of the site that were really easily manipulated. And the real big concern is that these are strategies that they have been taught. And these are strategies that you can find all over the internet. You can find on the web pages of all kinds of universities, libraries that are teaching them these strategies that ended up leading them to make incorrect judgments about the credibility of the sources, right? And so that was the real, for me, a really key point of this study was it's not that they, weren't applying any strategies. They were using these strategies and they were the strategies that they had been taught, but those strategies just didn't work. So what is it that students have been taught about source evaluation? I know we have a lot of folks in here that are librarians that'll be familiar with some of what I'm going to talk about. Other folks may not, but I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about the types of things that students have been taught around how to evaluate sources, especially sources that they find online websites, right? So this is an example of a handout from the University of Louisville that was really trying to highlight basically some of these source evaluation myths, what students have probably been taught. And so you can see that they have some clear questions here of the kinds of things that students are generally taught to look at in terms of evaluating sources. The domain, we already talked about that, but are there citations? Are there ads? How current is the information? And of course, there's nothing really wrong with looking at any of that information, but is it really going to lead students to a correct judgment in most cases about information that they find online? In some cases, maybe, but in some cases, maybe not. So again, I know that the librarians in the group will probably be very familiar with the CRAAP test. For those of you that are not, this is a very common sort of source evaluation method that has frequently been taught. And so it encourages students to really look at 5 key factors of any source. So the currency, the relevance, the accuracy, the authority, and the purpose. Right, and it's been very popular, right? It's of course very easy for students to remember. When you talk about the CRAAP test, of course, that always just gets their attention in class. And it highlights these 5 key areas to focus on. So here's some examples of some of the type of questions that you will see on most versions of the CRAAP test. And there's different versions that are out there, but most of them are pretty similar. And so they'll have questions like, are the links functional? Does it have advertisements? Can you find any contact information? Again, the URL and things like spelling, grammar, those kinds of things. And again, to be fair to the CRAAP test, this is not the only questions that are on there. But these are examples of very common types of questions that you will see on the CRAAP test. So based on that, what are some of the concerns about how the CRAAP test that you can think of that this method might raise for students' ability to evaluate sources? So if you have any thoughts, you can go ahead and add those responses to the chat, but I'd love to hear the concerns that folks might have thinking about those types of questions and using those questions to evaluate the credibility of information that they are finding. We'll give folks a chance to respond, those that are comfortable doing so. All right, so Madeline shared too checklisty and not promoting critical thinking. Lorian shared they never leave the source. They're trying to evaluate and do any lateral reading, right? Megan shared does not allow for nuance. Shared yes, lateral searching. Elizabeth shared yes, evaluates information in a silo and not part of a larger whole. Judy shared great point. Yeah, most of the examples I've seen only ask questions, but don't provide answers or the reasons for those questions. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. All right. So some of the concerns, Cheryl, my early training as a journalist always made me distrust the CRAAP test. Yeah. Right, so just a few different things. Folks have already raised them. That's very siloed. It keeps students on the site. Right, most versions of the CRAAP test have a lot of questions, up to 25 questions, which is a lot if you're thinking about evaluating a source, right? Who's going to go through it like that checklist approach, every single question for every source that they're evaluating? That's a lot of time, right? And then, lots of emphasis on the appearance, on, very superficial marks of authority, the presence of links and those kinds of things. Jerry also shared a great point. The CRAAP test has been criticized for excluding emotional responses, which can be misinterpreted and excludes diverse viewpoints. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jerry. I think that's a great point. Right, so a really key point to think about when we think about the CRAAP test is that it and similar kind of checklist versions have been around a long time. Right, and the CRAAP test really was developed in the very early days of the internet as librarians were looking at, what are ways that we can help students understand all of this information that they're finding. And so they really it thinks about websites the same way you think about print sources, but we know that that's not the case. We know that the way the internet has developed, we can't think about sources that we find online in the same way as we did print sources. They don't work by the same rules. So we need to think about, what are other things that we can teach students? What are other methods that we can teach students that are going to help them evaluate sources with the way the internet actually does work? All right, so I'll pause there to see if there are any questions or comments really quickly, and then we'll look more specifically at a few of the source evaluation myths, some of those that folks have already mentioned. So if questions or comments do come up, please feel free to go ahead and continue adding those into the chat. So the four key myths that I wanted to highlight today, several of them have already been mentioned by folks: domain, about us, links and references, and appearance. We're just going to really briefly look through these and think about why it's problematic that students may be using these as a way to evaluate sources. Several folks did mention in the Jamboard about peer-reviewed sources. And I actually had a part originally scheduled to go in here on trusting in peer review, and I ended up taking that out, but just be aware that that also, I completely agree that that is a challenge as well, that students learn about peer-reviewed sources and then they think that that means that they're automatically credible and trustworthy, and we know that that's not the case. So just wanted to mention that that definitely is important as well, although no, we're not going to focus on that in depth today. So evaluation by domain, as several folks mentioned, this is one that is really commonly used by students. And you can see this is an example of the guidance that students get. Pay particular attention to the last part of the domain name. Right. And so, you can find so many examples of this all over the internet where students are being told, look at the domain, right? That's going to give you some important information about the site. And based on the research, you can see that students have really taken that to heart. Different studies that have been done have found that students, automatically say, oh, if it's a .org, that means it's going to be trustworthy. Or if it's a .com, that means that I should not use it, right? Those have become really ingrained in a lot of students and something that they seem to really heavily rely on. And I know that's been my experience as well when I've worked with students in terms of source evaluation. Yep, Judy said, I went online to try to buy a site domain and was able to purchase a .org for $14 without any documentation. Yep, that is an excellent point. So that's actually good, leads right into our next question. So what is the concerns about using domain as an indicator of credibility? So Judy was already working in advance with her response there. But yeah, folks have other concerns about using domain as an indicator of credibility. Please go ahead and share any responses that you might have in the chat. Janelle said, yeah, one of my students said a .org is just a .com with money. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then Haley also shared, sometimes .com websites do share information obtained through research using a non-biased third party, so the information is technically sound. Mm-hmm. So Nathaniel said, I think it's certainly a good place to start a search, but evaluation must dive deeper into what kind of source it is and the authority behind it. Mm-hmm. So as folks have already mentioned, there's a lot of concerns around using domain, especially when we think about the .orgs and the .coms. As Judy indicated, anyone can get a .org site. You do not have to be a nonprofit organization. It is very simple. It's easy. It takes only a small amount of money and you can have your own .org site. You can be a commercial organization. You can be an individual. You can be a trade organization. Lots of evaluation of .org sites have found hate groups, cults, right? All of those using .org sites, right? So there's no bar at all, basically, for getting a .org site. And another thing to keep in mind, of course, is even if it is a legitimate, nonprofit organization, that does not mean that it's necessarily acting in the public good, right? That does not necessarily mean that it's a credible or trustworthy organization. It is also very easy to get nonprofit status. And so, just because the site has a .org, does that really say anything about their credibility? Not much. Jared said .gov can be held by small governments, which may not provide great information. Also, so the .com, the avoidance of .com. We know that basically all the major news sites are .coms, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, right? All of those are .com sites. And of course, as someone mentioned in the chat, there are many other credible commercial organizations as well. So just because a site has a .com does not mean that that information should be completely avoided. It's also important, I think, to point out that the homepage for most academic journals is .com, right? If you look for the Journal of the American Medical Association, that is like, I think it's JAMA.com is the site, right? And so, they're going to be avoiding a lot of, just cutting themselves off from a lot of credible information if they, have wholesale rejection of any source that is a .com. I think it's also important to note that a lot of that guidance actually usually tends to ignore non-US domains entirely. And so a student might encounter like a .uk and, ignore that because they don't really know what that domain actually means. So I think that there's a lot of concern, right, around using domain. Even, when we think about .gov or .edu, it's hard to tell how much that says about the credibility of the information. I think that there's a concern with .edu, for example, that students might equate .edu with scholarly sources. And we know that that's not the case, right? It needs to be an educational institution, but that does not necessarily mean that an article posted, on Ohio State's website is a scholarly source. So I think, again, lots of reasons why we want to try to move away from encouraging students to emphasize domain as part of the evaluation process. A few other things to consider. So folks mentioned this in the JAM board as well, the about us. So again, this is an example of guidance that students get of what to look for, check of see if there's an about us page. And I thought this was really interesting. This guidance said, organizations may have a mission statement that reveals a particular bias or stance. And that's certainly true that an organization may, clearly indicate what their particular bias or stance is in their mission statement. But I think it's just as possible that the organization is going to hide what their particular bias or stance is in their mission statement, right? They are not, there's no requirement that an organization is truthful in how they describe themselves on their site. And so, the research has found that students, again, put a lot of credibility into what sites say about themselves, right? And they don't recognize that there's no vetting process for the information that an organization puts up there, that they can say whatever they want about themselves. All right, so the spin page, as they call it, here's how we're going to present ourselves as being this non-biased, nonpartisan organization when we're really sponsored by a lobbying group. Links and references. Again, this is common guidance that students get. Check for a list of references. If a source has a list of references, it often means that source is well researched and thorough. Check for active links, make sure the links are working, those kinds of things. What's a concern about using the presence of references or links as an indicator of credibility? Love to hear what thoughts you all might have about potential concerns about references or links and credibility. So what are the references? Yeah, they might be bad sources or even fake. It is a form of demonstrating reliability if indeed those sources are reliable. Yes, Nathaniel. Jared said references can be to bad sources or possibly just circular. Yes, absolutely. Do they just keep linking back to other articles from the same journal or magazine for more clicks? Yes, absolutely. Right. So we know that just in general, thinking about the idea that if the links are working, that means that it's a credible site. We know that it's so easy to create a website now that having functional links is no signal at all. But as folks were mentioning, right, links or references can be a sign of deception themselves, right? They may have a lot of links, but maybe they're to sources that aren't reputable themselves. Maybe they're just linking to other pages on their same site, right? Or other pages within their same sort of system. Or maybe they're linking out to prestigious, credible sources, but to give credibility to themselves that don't actually support what they're saying, right? So the example they talk about in Educating for Misunderstanding, the site that they were evaluating has links out to the New York Times, and students would say, okay, this is a New York Times article, it must be credible. But the students that actually read that article found that it actually contradicted what the site said. right? And so it wasn't, they were counting on the fact that no one's going to go out and read all of the references. They're just going to see a bunch of references to credible sources and think that that means that those that actually support what they're saying. Right. So lots of concerns about just saying, oh, well, if it has links, if it has references, it must be credible. And then, of course, the last one, just to highlight, right, the appearance. Again, there's a lot of guidance out there. Does it look professional? Does it look well put together? And we know it is so easy to make a website these days. It is so inexpensive to do so that taking a, saying, well, this site looks really professional, so that means it must be credible. We know that that's not going to be a really valid indicator of credibility. All right. So we'll pause there to see if there are questions or comments. And I'd love to hear, and I think I already know this based on the comments in the Jamboard, but any of these that you've really encountered strongly in your work with students, and any additional ones that you might add, I'd love to hear those as well. So we'll have questions, comments, and time for a little chat discussion, and then we'll move on to some activities. I know for me, in my work, the .org, .com one has been, I think, the most prominent one that I've seen and heard in students in terms of how they decide whether or not a source is trustworthy. Mm-hmm. Just encountered bad references to begin with. Haley says, this will help me in teaching them how to find good ones. Mm-hmm. I fell for one once. I was helping a student research a difficult health topic, and I found one with the name of the condition in the URL. Turned out it was a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So Nathaniel shared, the point I have most to reinforce with students is that they cannot just stop at one element of evaluation. Rather, it is what each element is saying about the source as a whole. Yes. Yeah, so you can't just, there's not one thing that you can point to and say, yes, that means that this is a credible source, right? You have to take the source as a whole. You have to take it within the context of your specific information need. Sarah shared yes.com, or if it came from JSTOR, always the two I hear. Mm-hmm. Great. So this is just a quick sum up of the guidance from Educating for Misunderstanding, which I just wanted to share, right? So just making sure that we are updating all of the information that we are sharing about using domains in terms of credibility, really emphasizing that, even nonprofit organizations can be, not credible organizations. Eliminating, suggestions about the look or the links or the About Us page as, providing information that can necessarily be taken at face value, right? And then responsible use of Wikipedia as a fact-checking resource. We're going to talk more about that later. All right, so some teaching strategies and resources. So first thing I think is really important as we're thinking about how to approach teaching this is to identify what students already know or what students already think that they know. So we've talked about the common strategies that a lot of students have been taught, but I think it would be a great idea, when you're working with students around source evaluation, to get an idea of what they actually think, what they have been taught, what they haven't been taught, so you can really highlight those, any misconceptions that they might have. So the first couple of activities are all intended to be examples of quick ways that you can get some idea of the prior knowledge that students have around source evaluation. And so the first version is, a two truths and a lie kind of activity. You could also just do this as straight up kind of true or false statements. I've done this with a lot of different groups of students in various ways, but giving them statements such as, if a source is a .org, it should be considered trustworthy. Is that true or false? And this can be something that can be done in 10 minutes. You can, mix up the kinds of statements that you include to hit the key sort of evaluation misconceptions that you've been seeing in your students. And this will allow you to get some feedback from the students of what they've actually been taught, what they think about source evaluation, so you can really start identifying the key misconceptions that they might have. I do a lot of self-explaining activities. Any time that you can get students to describe their evaluation strategy to you, I think that that can be really helpful. We do this in our classes by having students complete a screencast. We give them a source, we give them a situation, and we go out there and tell them to just narrate their evaluation of the source. And of course, what we generally find is that they never tend to leave the site, and that they put a lot of emphasis on those factors that we've talked about, like the domain and the appearance and, who they're linking out to. But there are lots of ways that you can do this, audio descriptions. They could, just talk about their evaluation strategy with another student. They could even draw their evaluation strategy, let them be creative. But anytime where you have them actually explain why they are thinking something, how they would go about doing something and why they would do that way, that can again help you to identify that prior knowledge that they have, what they've been previously taught, so that you can start addressing some of those misconceptions that they have. So another sort of type of activity that you could do is have students kind of work in groups to identify what they consider to be the key factors related to source evaluation. I used to do this on our whiteboard. I would have them just tell me, what do you look at? What do you look at? And we would just start writing things down, what they think contributes to a source's credibility. And then you could have them use a source evaluation guide to consider some of those myths, and can think about how those differ from their own strategies. So I wanted to share the link here. I have created a source evaluation myths guide, and I'll share the link for this with everyone, but you can see that it basically just goes through sort of all of those big four evaluation myths for each student, kind of highlights what it is and why that is challenging. And so this is available for anyone to use, but I think that this could be a really great resource to do that kind of comparison, where they take some time to think about their own evaluation strategy, then they would review a resource like this, and then go back again and think and reflect on how this differs from what they have previously been taught. So we'll go ahead and go back to our presentation here. There we go. And then next, so several folks mentioned the importance of teaching students to use lateral reading, right? So rather than having students evaluate the source by remaining only on the site itself, and just looking at what is provided on that particular site, using that lateral reading strategy to go out, open multiple tabs, see what other folks are saying about that site, go out and use Wikipedia, use Google, whatever search engine you're using, find information about the organization, find information about the site, the folks that are listed on there, and provide that broader context that students will need to be able to place that source right within the bigger world of information. So you're not just relying on what the source tells you about itself, but you're going out and finding additional information, finding that additional context that you need to really be able to make sense of that source. So there's lots of resources out there about lateral reading. I'm going to share a bunch at the end. And then some folks also might be familiar with the SIFT method of source evaluation. So of course, one of the good things about the CRAAP test is that it was so easy for students to remember. So SIFT is another thing that you can do, is where if you want something that's a little bit more easy for students to remember, SIFT was developed by Mike Caulfield, right? And it encourages 4 steps of source evaluation. So stopping, right? So first, just thinking, taking that pause before you pass on or share information, pausing, investigating the source, right? So going out and finding out what you can find out about that source, finding better coverage. And so that's really emphasizing not just finding out about the source, but finding out about the claims that are being made. So, for example, with our trivia, I said that it takes 10 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of cheese. And so for some reason, say that was a controversial statement. Students would go out and find, what do other sources say about how many pounds of milk it takes to make 1 pound of cheese? Right? And then trace claims to the original context. So going back to that original source, whenever you get a news clip, a tweet, whatever it is that comes through, instead of just relying on that snippet that we tend to see, that headline, going back and finding what is the original source, where did that actually come from? And again, getting back that context that is often missing. Just check the chime to see where we are. So this is one example of a lateral reading activity that you could do. So I just call it like respond, review, reflect. So it's very similar to what we already talked about. Students write their description of their evaluation process, what they consider to be the most relevant. Then they look at some resources on lateral reading. I've got a few examples here, a video, a handout, and an online guide related to lateral reading. And then they go back and reflect on those differences between their original strategy and the lateral reading strategy, and what they think about lateral reading. Really great activity, I think, is one where you can have students compare the two strategies, maybe without knowing that what they're doing, right? So give students a source to evaluate, one that's maybe a little bit controversial, a little bit, dodgy, and have one group evaluate it using the CRAAP test, and have one group evaluate it using lateral reading, and then have them compare their evaluation. Right. And so that could give some really good insight to the students on, how helpful the CRAAP test is, how helpful lateral reading is, what parts of both might be beneficial, if there's one that they find that was more helpful than the other, and identifying the credibility of a source. And then I did want to just mention, we've talked a little bit about scholarly sources and the idea that students have that scholarly sources are always credible sources. And I do think that you could also use lateral reading, a lateral reading method with scholarly sources as well. So this could be a place where, you provide students with an article to review, and then have them just look at the article itself. What can you tell, that it was published in a journal? It might have some information on the author on the page, right? And they might be able to make some decisions about credibility based only on the article, but then have them use a more lateral reading method and going out and figuring out, what is the journal? Is it a credible journal? Who is the author? What other things have they published? Who has cited this source? Those kinds of things. They can also use Retraction Watch or other similar sites to go out and see if that article has been retracted, and what reason that might be. So I do think, again, it's helpful to, we talked mostly about websites today, but we know that students are going to be using other types of sources. And I think that a lateral reading method could also be really valuable for scholarly sources as well. All right, so got some time left here. I would love to hear if folks have any key takeaways from the workshop today. If folks have identified any next steps or action steps that they plan to take based on the workshop today. And just any questions, comments, ideas that folks might have. If you have a great activity that you've used related to source evaluation that you would like to share, I'd love to hear about that as well. So I'll give folks time to respond there, and I'll just mention just a few resources. And again, the slides will go out to everyone. We have our instructor resources at University Libraries site, has all kinds of resources on evaluating sources and credibility. So that's a great resource for folks. I have all of these on lateral reading and SIFT, so you'll have access to those when I share out the slides, in case any of those will be helpful to you, and just some general references and resources, as well as the attributions. All right, and so then we'll go ahead and go back here and give folks a chance to share questions, comments, thoughts, ideas that they might have. So Tesha shared, I like the lateral reading activity. It might be a good idea to pair with an annotated bibliography. I think you're absolutely right, Tessa. I actually have an assignment. I don't think I have it in the folder for today, but I have a lateral reading annotated bibliography assignment. So I'll try to add that one in to the activities in the folder that I'm sharing with everyone. But yeah, absolutely. Sarah shared, I love the idea of dueling CRAAP and lateral searching. And I think that's something, you can do that. You could do that in a group setting, but you could also have students do that individually, follow these steps and evaluate the source, then try it again using lateral reading. And how does your response to that source change based on what you found? So Madeline shared, I like comparing lateral reading to steps students would take to pick a pizza place. Are they going to make a choice based on one review or blog post? Yeah, absolutely. Is that that one person, that first review that you found, maybe that person, had a grudge against the owner. Maybe that person just doesn't like pineapple on their pizza, whatever it is. Yeah, so taking a look at a wide range of information sources to get that background context that you need. Mm-hmm. So Jerry shared, I've used examples of heavily cited articles that were later found to contain bad or manipulated info as a cautionary tale. Yes, you have reminded me to teach grad students in particular about retractions, maybe comments on articles. Yeah, it's actually one of my colleagues is doing a study right now on like retractions and errata and, in journal articles, and it's finding there's so many articles that are later either retracted or have found to contain errors. And yeah, this idea that just because a source is a scholarly source, it's a credible source, we know that that's just not the case. And we know that, heavily cited articles, that again, does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a credible source. I used to talk to students about an example from history, of a book that was very popular, and it got talked about a lot. So there were a lot of citations, but the reason it got talked about so much was because all the historians hated it and they thought it was, completely wrong. And so, yeah, if you look at it, oh my gosh, look at all of those citations. But when you read them, they're all like, no, I don't agree with this at all. Right. So, Sarah shared, love that. Madeline, we did that with finding headphones to buy, help with defining different authorities. I think it's a really great point too, Sarah, that, right, there's going to be, depending on the context, the situation and types of sources, there's not going to be one particular, type of authority that is going to always, that you're going to look for. Sometimes you're going to look for, more scholarly sources, sometimes you're not. So Grace shared, I had worked in the Oberlin Conservatory and had a student cite a YouTube lecture. It was not a great source. Do you have any specific eval guidelines for the YouTube world? So that's a really, really great question, Grace. And I think that goes back to this idea of trying to teach students about the importance of context as part of the evaluation process. So that there are certain situations in which it may be appropriate to cite a YouTube video, and there are other situations which it might not. So that's one aspect of the concern, is that, just in this case, I don't think it's appropriate that students are citing YouTube videos, really talking about that idea of, authority being constructed and contextual. And within this particular context, YouTube videos are not generally considered to be authoritative sources. Beyond that, I think that you could apply lateral reading strategies to YouTube videos as well, right? Who is the creator of that video? Having them go out and Google who that creator is, if there's a sponsoring organization for that particular video, or, if a certain organization that they're posting all of their content on this YouTube page, who's the organization that's posting that content? So I think that they could apply lateral reading. It might just take a little bit more effort to dig out sort of who's responsible for that site, but they could still go out and search and find information on that particular video. Cheryl shared, at least 2 Nobel laureates have had articles redacted. Haley shared, might create a group activity where I shared 3 to 5 sources with varying goodness and have the students evaluate in groups. Then we will come together as a class and discuss their reasoning and why they are or why are not correct. Yes, I think that sounds great, Haley. I've done versions of that kind of activity many times, and I think it is helpful for getting students to think about, it's not that a source is good or bad. necessarily, but there are levels, and there are times when certain sources are going to work, or certain sources may be considered more effective in some ways than others. So yeah. Let's see. Paige shared, I'm curious about the myth that objectivity or detachment about an issue means that a report is more true. Is this something that anyone is teaching or finding that students bring up when they evaluate sources? I think that that's definitely something from my own background perspective, Paige, that students are taught that it's, if it's objective, then it's true. And if it's someone, there's clear, strong emotion, then that means that it's not true. So yeah, I think that that's definitely something that I've seen, but I would love to hear what other folks have said, found as well in their examples. Jerry shared, a good activity might be to mention of studying a popular magazine and have students hunt down the original study. Yes. How'd you do that for faculty? Yeah, I think that's great, right? So we all know how things get mistranslated as they go across formats. And, the news headline that says that this study found this great, that chocolate cures depression. Right. But if you look at the actual study, it doesn't really say that at all. And so having students go back and track down that original source, can definitely be really helpful.